Hey everyone, welcome to the In Between podcast. I'm Gabe and this is Katie.
Hi, everyone.
And today we're going to be talking about an interesting topic that is a little closer to my heart with ADHD stuff, but just talk about the week in general. I know I'm still kind of in a space where I'm feeling a little bit sick or allergies or something, but you just got out of a space just like that too, right, Katie?
Yeah, and I feel like you can hear it in my voice, so it'll be interesting, especially for the our friends who listen to this. If you listen to this and my voice sounds different, it's because I've been drowning in allergies, or potentially a cold, or potentially COVID. I'm not really sure which I may or may not have passed on to you simply by bringing it into our home.
I mean, I don't really think you sound different. We just might have a little bit of like a
Oh,
lower energy today
I feel
because
like I do.
it's just, well, that's all right. But
But
I think you sound
yeah.
fine.
And also, I mean, we took a break for originally we had planned a break for 2 weeks, but then we didn't account for the last week for you needing to prep for preaching on this last Sunday, which I think was an honorable and totally fair reason to pause. So thank you, audience, and all of our beauty in between besties for giving us that grace. But also just the last couple of weeks have also been really helpful for me because I have started working out of a co-working space, and I just switched gyms from my favorite gym in the whole world to a still really nice gym but a much cheaper one, which is exciting. So I feel like there have been some rhythms of change and um I don't know, change and new things that have been like good changes for
Yeah,
me.
got the Crunch Fitness Pass now, so yeah,
Yeah.
we'll see how that space is, but yeah, a lot
Gonna
of
be
different
throwing that referral code to everyone.
there's gonna be a lot more changes coming up soon within our lives too. Um yeah, I know there's just a couple different things that are out there that I won't necessarily mention right now, but if you are in our personal lives, you may know what is going on.
Way to tease it.
But yeah, we'll probably talk about that more at some point anyways, once we have even more updates. Um but yeah, so what are we gonna be talking about today? Katie?
Yeah, so I'm pretty excited to talk about this. Prefacing that I am a neurotypical human, as neurotypical as you can get. I was driving in the car yesterday and was like, what does that really mean? Um, but from a science background of I am not diagnosed with ADHD or any major other like clinical anythings. So I'm excited to talk about this topic of framing, essentially talking about ADHD in the lens and context of what that has meant for you, how it affects you, what you think of being in Christian spaces specifically, and sort of with that question of is ADHD really a superpower? Because I know a couple people who have been diagnosed with ADHD and who are well into their adult lives, who will like totally take that stance of like ADHD is actually a superpower. I'm actually so glad that I have it. But I feel like learning more about it, and talking about it with you as well, and learning more about the different types of ADHD, that sort of like blanket, um, I don't know, that blanket framing hasn't doesn't seem to fit as well with everyone. So I'm just excited to talk about it with you.
Yeah, no, I am too, because definitely you're right on the dot there with like some people say it's like absolute superpower. It's amazing. They're so thankful that they have it. And there are some other people, on the other hand, who are like, man, I hate when people use the word superpower for ADHD and they like abhor the word. And so they're two complete different sides of that scale. And I think it has, its ups and downs, but it's definitely something where, if you haven't really experienced it, and even within that, like, there are so many different subclasses in kind of ADHD and different experiences where some people will say, "Oh man, like it's been helpful like as an adult," or some people would say, "Man, like I had a really hard time with it. I'm learning how to better optimize it." So there's so many different perspectives and like I guess histories to take into account where um yeah, for some people it is useful to use that verbiage. For some other people it's like, man, they feel almost hurt by it. And
Totally.
yeah, so it's a really interesting thing to talk about today.
And the thing with this episode is that originally we were going to have another friend of ours to give another perspective as both being a parent with ADHD, parenting a child. That will be a future episode in most likely season 2. But just to give a little bit more context for the perspective that you are bringing into this conversation, specifically with ADHD, I think it would be helpful if you could share whatever you think would be good, right, and helpful about your own journey of like ADHD, pre-diagnosis, diagnosis, like just, I don't know, whatever you think is useful to share would probably be
Yeah.
helpful.
Well, definitely would love to. So my kind of experience with ADHD has been, it was something that, was kind of exposed as a child. I wasn't like somebody who was super loud or really like interruptive or anything like that. I just would, constantly forget things that are going on. Even like things that were like directly in front of me. And I was like, sorry, like I just didn't notice. But did, great in elementary school, did good in middle school. And then high school was where I had more of a problem. But I was always like a good student. Teachers loved me, never would have any problems with me. And I was like a person who didn't bring any problems necessarily. Um, and my parents actually had me tested whenever I was really young. And I did not discover that until very recently within the past like year and a half, maybe.
Do you
Probably
remember
only
being
a year.
tested?
Oh no, I
Do
don't
you
remember
not
at all.
remember it at all?
No,
Okay, interesting.
I think maybe it was done when I was in preschool, like 4 years old or something.
Before your working memory kicked in. Got it.
Yeah,
Got it.
so I don't remember any of that at all. Um, but yeah, and then my parents told me within the last year, I think, whenever we were on a camping trip, they mentioned it, like, because I was saying, oh, I'm thinking about getting tested for ADHD, because it's always been something where it's like, okay, I probably have it, but how much is it really like affecting me or holding me back? Because I could see it was very obvious in my dad as well. And he kind of found different ways to kind of like optimize his life to work with his hands so that it wasn't as much of a problem with him or for him. But you could still see it in certain situations where it was like, well, there's a reason he doesn't do these things because these are really difficult for him.
Right.
Um, and so, yeah, I knew like, okay, he probably has it. I probably have it. Found it as came through genetics. And I was like, yeah, it's like 100% that we have it. But like, what does it really do? And it wasn't really until around high school, like middle of high school, that it really like started coming out. And it was like, man, I'm like super disorganized, um, really bad. What's the word? Procrastinator. And it was just
Mm.
like, whoa, like things are a little bit harder. And I started running into problems, and I was like, okay, like I might not be getting straight A's like it was before, but it's not that bad. And then college is when it really hit me, and it was like, dang, I I do not know how to work with this. Because my parents, having known that I did have ADHD whenever I was a child, my mom kind of took it upon herself to be able to help me out, to support me in that without having me labeled as a person with ADHD or,
Right. Or without
getting,
you knowing that that was
yeah.
what was happening. Right.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
so she was like, didn't want me to feel held back by a sort of label like that, which I do understand the sentiment of, but, um,
Totally.
didn't have any medication either because there was like a history of addiction within the family. Um, and so those different things combined, just kind of like the social, um, I guess, like expectations at the time where it was like, oh, everybody's getting it, everybody's getting ADHD, and is it really like a real thing?
Mm-hmm.
Um, that is what I had though, is the support from my family and specifically from my mom. And so whenever I was out on my own though for college, it was like, boom, there's no support. Like I'm out on my own, and then it was suddenly like these things were made super clear, and it was like, man, I've always been bad at these things, and now it's really shining. And then started to look into it a little more because I was like, yeah, I always thought I had this. And then looking into it and seeing all of the things that lined up and talking with friends about my experience too was like, wow, this is like spot on. Um, and this is kind of scary. But it was like, learning those different tools where it was like, man, I haven't been equipped all this time because I had no idea what was going on. But now that I've realized, like, oh my gosh, like it's in everything that I do, like the clothes that I wear, the ways that I fidget or like move around, or the ways that I talk to people, how I interact, like it's in every single sector of my life. There is like a pretty decent effect from it. And so started talking about it with my counselor at the time. He was like, yeah, it makes sense. And I was more focused on the depression, anxiety things for me. And yeah, then I started mentioning, hey, I'm thinking about getting tested. Parents were like, oh, you actually got tested when you were really young. And I kind of like shot at things. I was like, wait, like, I had no clue. Oh, yeah, we told you like, the year before. But it's still like, I'm a 23-year-old guy finding out that I was tested for ADHD all that long time ago. I never knew. And now that I'm like trying to figure out and trying to do all these things, I realize that potential has like been there to go discover those things, but I never actually was given a chance. And so yeah, a lot of tough experiences and things that I didn't really like notice. And there were things that like worked out for me because of like my ADHD in a sense. Um,
Hmm.
and yeah, so it's kind of like my experience. And there's the difference between like the inattentive versus the hyperactive. And I fall more
Or
into that inattentive
combined.
side. Yeah, or combined, kind of fall in the middle. So I fall more into the inattentive side rather than like a hyperactivity. So that's why it kind of like went unnoticed to people around me
Hmm.
um, a fair amount, or wasn't really seen as a problem for me. That's kind of my
Yeah.
experience. So now,
And
sorry, I was going to mention one last thing.
go ahead.
So now, in the more recent time, within the past couple of months, I've been seeing a new uh, psychiatrist in the area, and he actually mentioned prescribing Adderall to me. And it was something that I had asked doctors about before, but I was like, I don't really know anything about it. I don't really know if it would be like a good thing for me. I don't know if I really need it. Um, but more recently, and there were people that were like, oh, we're not just going to give it out to anybody. And I was like, well, I don't necessarily like want it or I'm seeking it out. Um,
You just
so
wanted
it,
to have a conversation about it initially.
yeah, and it was really hard because like whenever you go to some of the um, like different for the medical field out there and you're going for like a checkup or to just kind of tell them what's going on and are seeking like kind of a solution, then there's a really common experience of people telling you like, you don't have it. You're kind of just making it up, or you're just bad at doing these things, or oh, it's more of the anxiety thing. Your ADHD isn't really an issue. Um, and so I felt like really unheard. I'd gone to somebody before, and she was like, "No, I would never prescribe that for you if I even could." She could, but
Ugh.
um, it was like, okay, but here's like you're on an antidepressant. Here's another one. Maybe that'll help. Um, and yeah, it wasn't until recently in the past couple of months that my psychiatrist mentioned it. And I was like, yeah, I've been like curious about it because at this point I had heard some experiences of friends around me who have ADHD and anxiety and depression. And they're like, yeah, it's been like a helpful thing. And it really helped me realize much is like how much that's contributing to my overall life. And so now I'm on Adderall. It's a very low prescription or very low dosage. Um, but it was just more about actually like going in to explore it. I was like, man, I'm really not sure. I've never been seeking out the drug or anything. Um, but now that I have experienced it, it's like, okay, I have a better judgment over like what's just me and what's, more of that ADHD side. Um, so it's been quite a journey, and most of that stuff's been happening in the past couple of years,
Yeah, it's
which is
all
a
been
story for a lot of
pretty
people.
compact, um, as far as the sort of big moments anyway.
Yeah,
And I want to get into talking more about sort of where ADHD has sort of intertwined with interacting in community and Christian spaces. We will get there. But something that I want to highlight from what you just shared that we've talked about before, but just hearing you share it all kind of all together like that, it's making me think of how initially when around the time when you were tested for ADHD in like pre-K or whatever when you don't remember it. The other thing about that time and even, you know, your mom choosing not to share the label with you, so to speak, or like trying to stay away from medication and all of that, is that was also basically all the early and mid thousands time
Mhm.
period where um as a spouse of someone with ADHD, while you have been going through just naming um things that like make up your life and who you are and getting language and support for being able to name these things, I feel like I have just been going into a deep dive of ADHD in general and ADHD studies and are there resources and support and all these things. And part of my looking into ADHD as the spouse, is that the other thing is that there really weren't all that many in-depth helpful studies
Mhm.
at that time. Like most studies that have been done that have been more useful, even distinguishing the difference between hyperactive, inattentive, and combined, have been relatively recent. I remember I was listening to the podcast with Black Girl Lost Keys. I love her, and I forget her real name. But she was talking about how like her mom kind of went through a similar thing. She was closer to my age, where her mom didn't want her to go through getting the label or the medication or anything like that because of the stigma that was attached to it in the
Mhm.
late 90s, early thousands. Because at that point, I think there had only been one major study done in the 80s ish, and it was all with the same doctor or researcher, if I remember correctly. As great as the one guy was, there was only one major study, and then there were pretty big gaps. And something else that I just think is interesting is that I remember being in junior high around somewhere in the late thousands, I think was when I was in junior high, that my best friend in junior high was diagnosed with ADHD. And I'm pretty sure he probably tended in the hyperactive or combined
Mhm.
area, something like that. But I remember distinctly, it was really interesting to me watching him and his family walk through what they chose to do with that diagnosis, as far as medication, no medication, how much does it matter, how much does it make sense, and all of that. I remember thinking as a kid at the time of being like, what what does this mean? And
Yeah.
what do you mean your brain just isn't connecting in certain points? And that was my initial thought when I was a kid, which I feel like is fair. But from then up until the point that we started engaging in the journey of your ADHD diagnosis more intentionally, I mean, it's pretty easy to just think about ADHD, especially if you come from a culture or family or heritage or any sort of background where mental health already has a stigma, and then you throw ADHD on top of it as sort of a ghost diagnosis almost. And then it's like, well, just pay attention. Or
Yeah.
I feel like a really common vibe that gets thrown out at ADHDers is just try harder or do better or don't procrastinate. And I think the biggest takeaway that I, as a spouse of someone with ADHD, as a neurotypical human who does experience her brain firing at proper rates and communicating with itself, I think my biggest takeaway of looking into ADHD on my own is realizing that, oh, it's these aren't conscious choices, nor are they moral choices. I think that's the other thing too that gets associated with ADHD, and that I think is where shame spiraling comes in, which is another really interesting thing that I learned about, and where that is almost like a comorbidity with depression and anxiety. Um, but anyway, this is sort of my plug to people who are not diagnosed with ADHD who are still listening right now. That learning and having the understanding that those with ADHD are not just lazy, and they are actually probably trying 1,000 times harder than we are to just function at a normal and acceptable rate, is so important. Because as I've learned more about ADHD, one, I feel like I now see it everywhere, and two, I also feel like I seem to be drawn to people who are diagnosed with ADHD. there are a lot of ADHDers in my life. But anyway, that's sort of my plug and response.
Yeah, so a couple different things on that. You were talking about the resources side of thing, or just like general studies. And so yeah, ADHD wasn't like something that really got a whole lot of attention beforehand. It was mislabeled as a lot of different things. And then even whenever, it did start getting studied in the kind of late 90s, early thousands, the studies, if there were some, were focused more on the hyperactivity side.
Right.
And for the inattentive side, like you aren't really seeing studies regarding that until like, COVID time kind of kicks in, like 2019. Then it starts getting more attention. And another interesting or like sad thing about that is that, um, yeah, ADHD in women, majority of women who experience ADHD have inattentive, or they side towards the inattentive side of ADHD. And ADHD in women, not really studied at all yet. It's starting to get some attention now
Right.
because people are realizing, like, crap, like, there's nothing for it. Or you have women who are now experiencing it or are identifying with it. And they're like, there's nothing around. Like, I guess I'll just make it myself. Um, and so that's kind of the sad reality of it is like a lot of the resources for ADHD are made by ADHDers who are experiencing things, and they're like, I have no, there's nothing on it, so I guess I have to make it myself. And so that's like a little bit of a sad reality. Um, and yeah, I mean, I listen to, and if you want any podcasts or anything resources wise, feel free to let us know. Email us or anything.
Mhm.
But
I can link some in the show notes. We will
yeah,
link ADHD resources. How about that?
because one of the podcasts that I listen to, I used to listen to it like every single week. Now I haven't as much. It's
Yeah.
called Taking Control, the ADHD podcast, and they had, I believe it was a psychiatrist who has a really long tenure, a lot of experience, and he was just mentioning how, even within the books and resources that they are guided through, like leading up to their like qualification for being, uh, or their studies for being a psychiatrist or psychologist, like there's not very much in there about ADHD or how to help out
Right.
on it. And you really have to, like, even in that role, you have to seek out the resources yourself. And so that's why you have a lot of misinformed, um, I guess, like medical practitioners. Um, but
Unless they explicitly seek out information about ADHD. For the
yeah,
most part,
as I'm
most
saying,
medical professionals, yeah.
and those people will be like kind of specialized in that area, but it's not really something that's widely done. And like you mentioned, there's the mislabeling of things where I think the big root of it is that people want to label or want to be able to explain things in terms that they understand. And so when they see somebody with ADHD who's like, oh, this person forgot their homework, like maybe they didn't even, maybe they forgot to do it in the first place if they don't have it with them. Who knows if they even really did it? And like, oh man, you didn't put the time into like research this stuff, and to, make your paper. Like, poor planning from you. You should have done better or worked harder on it. And that's the way that they're able to interpret it. Like for them, the reality is, okay, if I didn't put the time in to do this stuff, then it's not going to be done well. And for ADHDers, you might put a crap ton of time in and you feel this insane block. But for other people, that isn't their reality. And so they want to try to define it as something they understand. They're like, oh, I feel lazy from time to time. And so I look at my project and I'm like, man, I don't want to even do this. I have no energy. Like, oh, I experience those things as a neurotypical or regular person. So like that's probably what they're having. But it's a very different reality and something they don't understand because they haven't experienced it. Or haven't really heard experience of other people around them or haven't tried to listen in on those things. So I think that's where a lot of those different labels of lazy or um, I don't know, just like even sometimes depressed, like um, yeah, how these different things get thrown around from people.
Well, and also talking about
Bored.
how well, I think y'all do get bored though, but that's not the conversation. Talking about understanding, particularly the idea of understanding ADHD for those of us who are not diagnosed with ADHD. is a perfect bridge into talking about how, especially now that you know that you have ADHD, has affected the way that you interact in community, in forming new relationships, specifically within churches, especially because in the last, how long have we been married? In the last year and a half or so, we were in the process of just trying to find a church community to attend and be with. And now we have found one. And I know that you've talked about ADHD and mental health a little bit with our pastor, but I mean, the original title of this episode was talking about how ADHD affects engaging with communities. So, what are your thoughts about that? And we haven't talked about this a lot, really. So, I really want to know, what are your thoughts about that?
Yeah. So, like I said, I have more of the inattentive side of ADHD. And so mine might be represented differently than somebody who has hyperactive ADHD or leans towards that side. And I also want to preface this with like, this is by no means, medical advice. We are not professionals in the medical field or anything. So if you're looking for more information, I would highly encourage you to go seek out a medical professional for any help on that side. But
Yes.
yeah, my experience has been like, so there's a lot of things that are closely linked with my ADHD, including like,
Which is
depression.
typical.
Yeah, the depression, the anxiety, which are for those who with ADHD, your chances of having those are like way higher than a neurotypical person for having, like I said, anxiety and depression. But also very introverted too, so that leans with that inattentive side. And a lot of my experiences have been with being an introvert, and this is kind of something that we'll talk about later on too. Um, but it's difficult to interact with people sometimes because you are not really like an outspoken person. You're kind of someone that like almost goes by the wayside sometimes. And people are like, "Oh man, like that's like nobody might have a problem with you because you're not obtrusive or anything or not problematic, but they just don't notice you as much."
Right. You're
And
not
so
making waves.
yeah, and you go a lot like undercover and people don't really notice you, and you have a hard time really like I have a really hard time actually like diving into the community because I've sit on the wayside and will be like, I feel like I have something to give to this group, like I have value here maybe, but I don't really feel that people like value it. Um and also I a lot of times will question my own value and say like, man, I don't really know if I have, a whole lot that I really bring to this group. These people are all having a conversation, talking, and I might come in for like 5% of the conversation or something, or 10%. And man, I don't really feel like I'm actually here, but they wouldn't care if I wasn't here. So that produced a really difficult time actually engaging in like getting those deep relationships. And, people just tend to not really ask you a whole lot of stuff whenever they don't hear you talking as much. And so it's kind of that repeated cycle where you don't speak up, people don't really think about you, and so you're never really asked like, oh, what's your opinion on things, what's like been going on in your life. There's not as many questions like those because the people that sometimes do ask those questions are the a little more like active or energetic people, and
Right.
so you don't really get noticed by them sometimes. And so whenever there is somebody who is on that what's the word, on the extroverted side, who notices an introverted person, like that could be an amazing relationship. It'll
Yeah.
most
It
likely
could
be
end
like,
in marriage.
yeah, it'll most likely be like really great. But it's almost like a bridge that an extroverted person has to cross, or um, understanding someone outside of their self who functions very differently. And I'm very lucky to have you because I am the introverted one, obviously, and you were the one to, whenever I was in the Bible study that you were leading, you were the one to ask me sometimes, like, what are you thinking? Because there's
I would
always
tell
something.
Kyle to stop talking.
Yeah, and even like we have this hyperactive and inattentive side of things, but even in the inattentive, like it's not as if your brain is not hyperactive. hyperactive is more of that like extrusive signals, but inattentive has more of the intrusive signals, and has a lot more of like, or has a lot more to do with how your brain is working on the inside or how you're feeling on the inside. And so I will, like whenever there's a conversation going on, I feel like, man, I'm not really a part of it. And so I'll go down a huge rabbit hole in my mind. So my mind, super, super hyperactive and super hyper focused on different things, but it doesn't show up as much on the outside as hyperactive people do. And so I think like they, there are even the namings of ADHD and ADD. I think
Mm-hmm.
pretty much all of those people that have ADHD or ADD fall into ADHD, but we have been taught one way of how to interpret what the hyperactivity looks like. And if it's not that, then it's not really hyperactive. They just lack attention, which is wrong in and of itself. But maybe we'll talk more about that.
We can talk about whatever you think we should talk about. Because I think the other thing that I'm hearing in all of what you just shared, that I think I've also picked up from other ADHDers who are sharing their sort of journeys and lives and experience with ADHD, is that it is really difficult to parse out like where almost where the ADHD ends and where they begin, but then also where anxiety and or depression
Mhm.
are also at play, and where it's like the question being, where is it that ADHD is driving the boat, and where is it that anxiety or depression is driving? Where am I on the boat? And when is it that I'm driving?
Yeah.
That I just, again, having just been trying to find as many resources as possible, that seems to be a pretty common thought, whether somebody's diagnosed with ADHD, hyperactive or inattentive or extroverted or introverted. It just, ADHD seems to be what I imagine it as, is like at the center of a spider web, so to speak, and it's just attached to a lot of other things.
Mhm.
Um, that make it really difficult. And the other takeaway that I have from all of that is that, again, having and living with ADHD and ADHD mind just sounds exhausting. Which is my reminder to the neurotypicals, to, if you identify someone with ADHD, give them grace, even when it doesn't make sense to you.
Yeah. They're gonna forget to text you sometimes. They're gonna
Or a
forget about
lot.
the calendar things, yeah, or a lot. They're possibly even going to forget that you exist unless they see a notification at the top, or have your, or like interact with you daily. It's a big part of it is like, for all ADHDers, basically, for all of them, they experience that hyperactivity in their brain. And so, like you said, it can be quite exhausting because that goes into every part of our lives. It is really difficult seeing where one ends and one begins, because everything is interlinked. Like when you have ADHD, it's not just oh, it shows up in, I'm like hyperactive in this thing, and like I want to play outside and play video games and stuff. It's a part of how your brain works in general and how you process things. And so inherently, it's going to affect everything in some sense. There might be some sort of like categories or sections of your life where you're thinking, oh man, like I don't really see a whole lot of it there. Um, but there are other places, where you might see it a ton. And it is in every single part of things. And so for me, like exploring that question of where does my ADHD start, and where does my anxiety start? Where's my depression start? What is the kind of like scale? Is this like certain thing that I'm dealing with? Is that like 25% ADHD and then 75% anxiety? Like it's really difficult. And if you
Mhm.
find yourself asking that question, you're not the only one. But also, it's a really difficult question to like actually look into, because it can be pretty darn frustrating. And people that do experience ADHD, like I would kind of like work people against that. Um, 'Cause, yeah, like I said, it's difficult. You feel like there's so many problems and you don't know which one is the actual issue. But at the end of it, like everything can be an issue and everything can be like good sometimes, possibly not everything. But yeah, I think it's a hard thing to parse out, and
Hmm.
you can get frustrated and sad doing that sometimes.
Okay, so I've been trying to figure out how to transition into this other thought that I'm having because I'm surprised that you haven't talked about it yet, and there is no transition. This is the transition.
Well, let me hear
Um,
what you're wanting to talk about. Maybe I can come up with a transition.
yeah, great. Well, what I would love to hear you share a little more about is shame in ADHD, especially with the term shame spiraling. I had never heard of until looking into ADHD things. And what I'm wanting to hear from you is where you think or where you have experienced, if at all, shame and your ADHD interplaying with engaging in community, especially if it's something like church where it's like, and we go to such a small church that, somebody could be like, why hasn't Gabe texted me? Or why didn't he text me back? Or like, because it seems like I would think shame and forming new relationships and just ADHD in general would make that pretty difficult. I don't know.
So my
Those things.
transition for that would be you've already talked about the cycle where you feel like you're not really like seen or don't really talk up a whole lot, and then there are some experts or just people in general who might not see you and don't actually like ask you or talk to you about things, and so you kind of go more on the hidden side. How does that
Boom.
cycle affect how you think people view you?
Great.
Maybe.
Now answer that question.
So my idea of myself or the way that I look at myself, super warped. I know that. I think everybody around, or yeah, pretty much everybody around me knows that too.
Uh huh.
Um, and knows that
People
I do.
listening to this podcast who know you and love you know that.
Yeah, and a lot of people know that I do not give a whole lot of grace to myself, unfortunately. And so I've always had a very difficult time with that shame. And yeah, it wasn't something that I necessarily like linked to ADHD, but definitely like falls into that, and with anxiety, depression too. Of like when we're mentioning like being hyperactive, particularly in your mind, like I have a really difficult time sometimes hearing people in the conversation because I go into my own mind and in my own thoughts. And then I'm like, oh, sorry, like I wasn't listening. I like completely blinked out and zoned out. Um, and that hyperactivity can sometimes result in like I will look back into things that I've done or that I've said, and I'm like, man, I feel like I should have talked more in that conversation, or I feel bad that I didn't text this person, and you start to label yourself as different things because of what you've done. You tell yourself who you are, and that shame gets heavily interlinked with it when you feel like you have failed in something, or when I feel like if I've forgotten to do something, I'm like, man, I really wanted to like help this person out, and or like I thought it would have been great to interact with them, and now like I feel like I've lost something, and so I I have made a decision that's lost me something, or that's negatively impacted a person, even though they might literally look at their phone and be like, oh, I guess he didn't text me yet. Maybe I should text him back again. Like then I'll be like, man, this was a moral failure, and I failed that person. Uh, and the shame kind of cycle definitely interlinks a lot with the ADHD, and like I said, the mind is like constantly going, and so I have a really hard time getting stuck in my mind and going through this anxiety and depression cycle where they're all interlinked, those things, but they all just like kind of repeat themselves of like, oh, my ADHD draws or pushes into my anxiety and my depression, or like it pushes into my anxiety, and my anxiety makes me think, man, like I did a really poor job with that, or like, and I feel like I'm not really providing a whole lot, and then that leads into me kind of like sinking back and questioning my value, and then that leads to me being depressed a little more, and then the depression, like again, the ADHD comes up, and then I get even you keep on sinking into a further and further place sometimes, and it's hard to pull yourself out because there's no attention on like what you can actually do better or what you can be thankful for around your life, all the attention is on yourself. And that can be really difficult.
Right. And it sounds like when it comes to, I guess when it comes to self-perception with ADHD, at least for you, I won't speak for everyone else.
Mhm.
It sounds like you're essentially hyper-focusing
Yeah.
on negative, like it's almost like you're taking a magnifying glass to things that are morally neutral, neither good nor bad, and you're assigning morality to it and saying that you are a bad person. And then on top of that, because you're assigning to yourself the label of bad person based off of an action that you wish you hadn't have done, that you just start to take that hyper focused, overblown like choice or action or thing that you forgot or whatever, and you make it your whole identity.
Yeah, that's another thing too of why like the ADHD definition is being questioned, why even using that acronym is being questioned. Is because
I
for,
question it.
yeah, and I think there hopefully there'll definitely like hopefully there will be a new thing that comes about, a new thing that the smart people come up with where it's like, oh, that's a good little acronym.
That's a
But
good one. Mm-hmm.
ADHD is a difficult one to use because the hyperactivity is true, but the attention deficit, that's not true really for us. I think a lot of ADHD people will agree with that. And from my experience,
That's
like,
a good distinction to make.
yeah, from my experience, it's not that I lack attention. It's that my attention is not pointed in places where I want it to be. Or I don't really feel like I have control over where my focus or my attention goes. But it's definitely there. I can definitely like hyper focus on, some sort of hobby that I'm loving doing right now. Or on
It's
some
gonna go
really
somewhere.
random person that I'm like, oh, the other day I was looking up Shaquille O'Neal's wife. And then from there, I went to that ex-wife's husband. The husband's apparently a pastor. And so I was searching about him for like hours. And I was like, huh, these things are really interesting. Knowing that none of that's really like that interesting or important at all. But I just go on this hyperactive thing where I'm like, I I desire to research this. And you
It's a
just go
really
down that
good
rabbit hole.
example.
And so yeah, it's not that the people lack attention. It's like you don't really have a whole lot of control over where it goes. And a lot of
That's a
time,
good description.
people have different experiences of where it actually goes for them. Um, but for my attentiveness, for my attention, a lot of it is in myself. And even for actions that other people have, I'll blame myself a lot for their actions. Uh, and so that shows up in like, oh, this person didn't invite me to this thing. And, they might have invited these other people, but they didn't invite me for a reason. And then I'm trying to think of all the different things. And they might have just forgotten or just might have not really
Yeah.
thought about it because they're used to this group of 3 or 4 people. They've been in their group chat forever. Maybe they just didn't remember.
Or they
Um,
sent it in the wrong group chat.
yeah, or like, they might forget to show up to a thing. And I'm like, oh yeah, like I completely understand. And there's no problem that I have with them, but for me, big problem. Big problem. So difficult and exhausting, like you mentioned.
Yeah. Okay, so closing thoughts on the question,
Mhm.
especially with everything you just shared, of is ADHD a superpower? What are your sort of summative thoughts with that question?
I feel like not a cynic, but just like really half glass empty person in this conversation, which I don't mean to be. I just want to share with people
Bring it
some of the
on, buddy.
experiences that I feel like are important to take into account and important for other people to understand whenever they're interacting with somebody who does or might possibly have ADHD. And for those people that have ADHD, like kind of sharing experiences that they might really align with. Like, man, I have no clue, this or that sort of thing. And I also don't want people to just like self-diagnose based off of this or TikTok videos. I would encourage people to
Right.
listen to other people's stories, and that's why we'll link some podcasts for that. because I think it's really cool hearing other people's unique stories. And we love storytelling, so that's what this is all about.
Mhm.
But for myself, I think ADHD was like, it kind of made me a little bit of a genius in being able to cram things in earlier in life. But whenever it became an issue, everything fell apart. And I realized it was everywhere. And so I don't think that we should use the term superpower for ADHD. That might be true for yourself, where you're like, oh man, it works out really well for me because I've figured out a way to optimize it. But for those people who are really struggling with it, it's a really difficult thing to hear. Like when you're told over and over again, oh, it's a superpower. Oh, it's a superpower. Well, why is life so difficult for me? And it perpetuates that idea of like, man, well, I just might like, even though you figure out, okay, I have ADHD, so maybe a little bit of what I do is like based on that. And maybe I'm not like a terrible person. And then you hear, oh, it's a superpower. And you're like, well, maybe I am a terrible person then. We're back to square one almost.
Right.
And so I think a label like that is not helpful. I think there are pros and cons that it'll have in terms of having that hyperfixation. Like if it works out for you and you hyperfixate on something that you love, but also like something you can do for a job, amazing. That's awesome. But you'll, yeah, it just, it will negatively impact you in some way, like, kind of just wasting your time in general or making yourself be in a bad place emotionally or mentally. But there can be positives. And so listen to other people's stories and explore it for yourself and try out new things, because the same things that work for a neurotypical person are probably, well, they're not always going to work for you. And so you've got to figure out ways to optimize your life. But once you do, I think there can be a fair amount of positive effects or feedback from that can be hopeful and sometimes inspiring.
Totally. And thinking as a third party observer with no personal interest in the matter, which is a quote from a movie. So bonus points if you know what movie that's from. But thinking about the question of is ADHD a superpower, or even the framing, the language choice to frame
Mhm.
ADHD as a superpower and like where that desire came from. Because I remember coming across a song from a pretty famous influencer couple however many years ago that I think it's literally called ADHD is a superpower, if I remember correctly. And I'm pretty sure they have t-shirts. Um, there's a part of me, with no skin in the game as far as I don't have ADHD, that the desire to frame something that sort of at face value not only could be taken negatively by the person who has it, but has had a major stigma attached to it um in community in globally. ADHD isn't really something that has really become widely well understood, which makes sense because the resources are only just now getting to the experts in the medical field. So of course it hasn't trickled down to the rest of us normal folks yet. Um I feel like the desire to frame it as something positive I empathize with, and at the same time, because of everything that you just said, I almost think that the question, you know, is it a superpower? Is it not a superpower? The choice to label it that way or not, I think is the wrong. I think it's hard for me to say wrong, but I'm going to say it. Like, I feel like it's not as helpful as framing it as just being like to someone who has ADHD, to like looking at you in your face and saying, yes, you have ADHD, and it does not affect your value as a human. It doesn't make you any worse of a person. It doesn't even make you a worse worker. Like there are certain jobs that you will not be as efficient at, perhaps.
Mhm.
But I think instead of just the whole superpower or not, and like there's no need to take something that makes life really difficult and a struggle and be like, no, it's actually great. Aren't you so glad that you struggle on a daily basis? Instead of going down that route, which feels very like optimism is a fruit of the spirit kind of vibe, like that's not helpful. Whereas I'm like thinking of Jesus right? He was faced with people with various ailments across the span of his public ministry on earth. And he didn't look at them and be like, aren't you so glad that you can't walk? Or aren't you so glad that you're an outcast of society? He just acknowledged their dignity and value as humans and then interacted with them as he so chose, as far as healing them or their family or whatever. But anyway, that's sort of my closing thought here, is just that for people who have ADHD, just a reminder that it doesn't make you less valuable. It doesn't make you a less valuable member of society or work or your family. ADHD is not a moral statement, and it is not a value judgment. It just is a thing that you have to deal with that is really hard, and I would argue unfair, because it sounds really exhausting.
Yeah, I've got like a
And
couple different things that are popping in my mind for metaphors.
yeah, and to those who don't have ADHD, my closing thought here is, one, I encourage you to do some research, because I would bet money, real money, that you know at least one neurodivergent person in your close circle, not just some random coworker who you see every so often, once a month at the office or something. Like, I am absolutely positive that you have at least one neurodivergent human in your life, in your church, in your small group. If you're a pastor, you definitely are pastoring neurodivergence. As a teacher, anything, I know that you know a neurodivergent person. And researching, looking into it, can be a way that you can show grace to the ADHD community. Similarly, as when I tell white folks that doing research on social justice and inequity in this country, like, that's for you to go research. That's not for the Black community or the Latinos or the Asian. It's not for us to inform you. Go do your own research. So that's what I have to say with
Yeah. I mean, people, whenever they're talking about anxiety, for instance, nobody's going to make a video saying anxiety is a superpower. It's not. Somebody might say, oh, it's a superpower because, like, you're really good at observing yourself and, like, fixing things. That might be a superpower for the other people around you, and you might be a good worker because of it, but it's going to hurt. And, for instance, if somebody said having a wife is the best thing you can, or getting a wife is the best thing you can do. For me, like, my wife, Katie, she is a blessing to me. And, like, my life is made a whole lot better because of her. But for other people, like, if somebody watched that video and they were like, okay, my goal is I need to get a wife. No, that's not a good thing to have. A wife can be a blessing if, like, done the right way, and if it is actually, like, if they're helpful to you in a like, good person that works with you. But if they're a terrible person, you're not just going to say, oh, well, I'm going to get a wife because this person said that it's the best thing I can do, so I'm going to go do it.
I see where you're going with this. Yes.
People, you can't necessarily just say it is a superpower. I think you can say something like, how ADHD can be one of the most powerful tools in your toolbox, or it can be a great resource for you. Because, I don't know, like, it's almost like if I had a pair of scissors, and I was like, oh man, scissors are the best tools. Like, I can cut all these things with it. But if I get to something that I actually have to build, those scissors aren't going to work out. So I want to put myself in situations where I can use the scissors, but sometimes they're not going to be helpful at all. And it's actually going to, like, negatively contribute to things. And so I think talking about how to optimize it, or how to optimize your life to use it to the, like, most, or like, to its best value, and getting the most out of it, like, I think is a helpful conversation. Like I said, hearing those experiences where people are like, oh, this really works for me, and this doesn't. But I don't think that it can just be labeled as a superpower, because it's not what everyone gets. And I would probably rather have flight or invisibility than I would have ADHD.
And that's that on that.
My closing thought.
Anything else? Any other thoughts? We would normally ask what's the invitation here, but I feel like that was basically, those were the invitations. But do you have anything else to say
like you
to the
said,
people?
learn more about those neurotypical people around you, like ADHDers.
You mean
Give them-
neurodivergent people?
Oh yeah, did I say typical? My bad. But
I'm not
learn
going
more
to cut
about
that
those
out either.
people. Give them grace whenever there are things that are happening, and yeah, it'll help us to, like you said, learning about everybody in their different situations is important. And for those people, they have different way they need to be loved, and so why not learn it? If you can love someone better by doing that or taking that time, why not go for it? Like if it's such a huge group of people that are around you, that's our goal in life. I think like for us is loving people the best way we can. Yeah, learn to love.
Amen. What? Ooh, learn. Always learning. That's really what we're on a mission to
Yeah, that's
do.
what my
Learn to love.
sermon was about a little bit too this weekend or this past weekend.
Well, and on that note, we've got nothing else for y'all.
Maybe we'll wait for the
So
sermon in the notes.
maybe. Thanks for tuning in. If all goes well, we'll see you again in a week, and then the week after that, and I think 1 or 2 weeks after that as well. So we're rolling with the second half of season 1. And also please do rate, comment on Spotify, leave a review with words on Apple. We're gonna start reading them out loud. So leave us some reviews so that we can read them out loud. So that'll be fun. But that's all we got. Peace, y'all.
Yeah.
Thanks.
See you later. Bye.